You have probably heard of Geshelli Labs. A particularly loud hype reviewer has mentioned Geshelli products in the past. I have never used Geshelli gear, but recently had the opportunity to test them. Dave, the honest audiophile, loaned me 3 Geshelli products: the JNog 2 DAC and 2 amplifiers, the Erish and the Archell 2 Pro. I appreciate Dave sending me his gear to review. If you want to follow Dave's audiophile journey, check out his website. The JNog 2 DAC is also referred to as just the J2. This DAC costs $250 at its base price. The Archell 2 Pro seems to be discontinued, but used to cost around $150. The Erish is still sold and costs $200. Is Geshelli stuff worth considering, or simply more hype from the clown factory? One obvious aspect of Geshelli gear is that it looks different. You'll get a mixture of metal and plastic components. All of their gear is at least partially see-through. On some, you can change face and back plates. However, all Geshelli gear is simply designed and unpretentious. Looking at the J2, Geshelli lets you choose a particular color scheme at no additional cost. However, if you want the J2 with USB connection, then you have to add another $50 to the price. In its base configuration, the J2 comes with 4 SPDIF inputs and RCA and XLR outputs. The J2 uses the ES9026 DAC, which is an older yet reliable DAC. The front panel of the J2 has a button for power and an input selector and additional inputs. There are also 4 LEDs that light up in different ways, indicating input and output status. The LEDs are not labeled, and you will need to memorize what each LED function is. The back panel has the optional USB and additional SPDIF inputs, along with the other outputs. The Erish is a very small amplifier, encased in hard plastic and metal shell. You can choose among several color options. The Erish is a simple amp with only a balanced XLR for inputs and output. There is no RCA connection option here. There's also no quarter-inch headphone output. The discontinued Archell 2 Pro is built similarly to the Erish. The Archell has only a quarter-inch headphone output. However, it has both RCA and a standard 3.5mm input on the back. This means that you can connect either your DAC or a phone, tablet, or other source through the 3.5mm connection. The front panel has a power switch and a switch that doubles as both gain and input selector. Overall, it is patently obvious that Geshelli products are bare bones and simple to operate. The J2 supports all forms of PCM and DSD up to 512. DSD is supported only through USB connection, however. There is no Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or MQA support. The 2 amplifiers, the Archell 2 Pro and the Erish, are also very simple. Strangely, however, when you buy one or the other, you get incredibly limited input and output options. I have no concerns about the design and build. Indeed, I think all of these products have solid construction. The appearance is likely not appealing to everyone, but it is different from the competition. The feature list is short for these products, and this puts their value under a bit more scrutiny. I tested all the Geshelli gear over the course of several weeks. We have a lot of individual components, so I decided to get a baseline understanding of each product's performance. I listened to each item by itself and then in a stack configuration. The J2 is a plug-and-play DAC. You don't need to download drivers. The Archell 2 Pro and Erish are simple and easy to set up. One thing I will highlight is the power supply for each of these products. The power supplies are tiny compared to the giant brick you get with other products like the Schiit Magni. However, they do feel pretty cheap, no better than most power supplies you'll get bundled with some Chinese stuff, such as the Lox GP20. To determine the overall sound signature of each product, I broke down my testing to concentrate on one product at a time. I first listened to the Archell 2 Pro. I connected it to my Songcause LAQX-D1, which is a neutral DAC. I compared it to my Schiit Magni Heresy in an AB configuration. I listened with my passive AB switch using the neutral Allo Audio S4X. I listened to my standard test playlist. Next, I repeated this same test using the Erish. The Songcause outputs from RCA and XLR at once, so I merely had to add the Erish into the chain. Since the Geshelli amps have either a quarter-inch or XLR output and not both on each, I switched to my Aventone planar. I used my Hart audio cable kit. This was not a perfect or desired testing method, as I had to stop the music and manually switch cables, but this was the only way to test. After this, I listened to the Erish and Archell 2 Pro side by side and tried to determine if I could hear any differences. We will talk about the J2's test a little later. Let's first discuss the amplifier performance. As I listened to the Archell 2 Pro against the Heresy, I was able to easily volume match. I switched back and forth and played dozens of different tracks of various genres. There was no audible difference whatsoever. Both amplifiers sounded identical. There was no alteration in bass, mids, or treble. There was no difference in timbre. Everything sounded exactly alike. I tested the Archell 2 Pro against the Erish. I tried to volume match to make sure, and I think I got reasonably close to achieving matched volumes. Again, there was no difference at all. Both Geshelli products sounded identical. The Magni Heresy, Archell 2 Pro, and Erish all sounded exactly the same. These are neutral amps, and if you were to do a blind test or an actual A-B comparison, then you would hear no audible differences, I think. I also compared the Geshelli amps against the topping A30 Pro, which was still on loan from Apple's Audio. And I repeated the tests, and again found that the Geshelli amps sounded exactly the same as the comparison amp. The A30 Pro and Geshelli products sounded identical. I next compared the J2 against the LA QX-D1, the Shit Modi 3, and the topping D30 Pro. I tried using Voice Meter Banana to use two DACs at once from the same computer, but that did not work out for me. Voice Meter crashed my system. So I used my MacBook Pro and my Windows PC with one DAC connected to each. Since we know that the Archell 2 Pro and Erish sound exactly the same, I used them in this test. I plugged the Archell into the Soundcause and the Erish into the J2. I used several headphones, including the Avantone Planar, Allo Audio S4X, and Shure SRH1540. I played the same tracks on both setups and tried to volume match to the best of my ability. Switching back and forth without an A-B switch made hearing any minor differences very difficult. However, it appeared to me that the Soundcause was slightly warmer sounding. What I thought I heard was that the J2 was producing slightly clearer mids with vocals a bit more obvious in a mix. I played around with the volume knobs just to make sure it was not a difference in volumes. However, over the course of about 45 minutes going back and forth, I still had the impression that the J2 was ever so slightly clearer, but the difference was so minor that I really cannot give this impression much credit. I decided next to use my Rupert Neve headphone amplifier. This amp is neutral and has RCA and XLR inputs. It has 1/4 inch output. This amp will let me select among various input options at once. With the RNHP, it was clear that there were no perceptible differences between the Soundcause and the J2. I could volume match using the volume adjustment option on the Soundcause, so improper volume was not a problem with the RNHP. If nothing else, this demonstrates how imperative it is to do real A/B tests rather than resorting to plug-and-play methods, because that relies far too much on memory and is vulnerable to improper volume matching. I next switched out the Soundcause for the Shit Modi 3 and continued to use the RNHP. I volume matched using my playback software on both computers. Switching back and forth, I heard no differences at all between these DACs. Both DACs sounded identical. Finally, I compared the J2 against the topping D30 Pro. There were audible differences, which I attribute to variation in tuning. The D30 had a slight bass roll-off compared to the J2. Vocals sounded somewhat clearer on the D30, but also thinner or more distant. Female sibilance and grain was slightly accentuated on the D30. Treble instruments tended to sound practically the same between the two DACs, but there were some instances where the D30 appeared to have marginally clearer treble rendition. Frankly, I am not going to belabor the point. The fact is that the Geshelli J2 sounds no different from the Soundcause and the Modi 3. I'm sure some people will feel the need to disagree, but if they are that adamant, then they should put their money where their mouth is. As always, when people disagree with my findings, I challenge them to do actual A/B tests and demonstrate their methodology. That is the least you can do if you want to credibly say someone else is wrong. In my experience, the Geshelli products sound the same as the products against which I compared them, except for the D30. I reviewed Geshelli's power measurements from their website. The Erish, with a 4 VRMS input, was measured to provide 1 watt into 32 ohms. Geshelli provides no other power output measurements for higher impedances. The Archell 2 Pro is discontinued and Geshelli evidently deleted its product page. However, I researched and found that the Archell was rated to provide around 600 milliwatts at 16 ohms. Again, Geshelli did not provide measurements for higher impedances. I could not find third-party measurements to verify Geshelli's claims. My user experience has been fairly lackluster, however. I am not particularly impressed with the Geshelli amplifiers and their power output. Assuming Geshelli's measurements are accurate, they pale in comparison to other products which cost about the same or less than either the Archell 2 Pro and the Erish. Neither Geshelli amplifier struggled to drive typical dynamic driver headphones up to 150 ohms. Indeed, the HD6XX got plenty of power, and that is a 300 ohm headphone. When I used my Bear Dynamic T1 Gen 2, which is a 600 ohm headphone, I found that the Erish provided a bit more power. As a result, the drivers in the T1 came closer to peak performance than on the Archell. On the Archell, the T1 had a slightly less clear sound. The audeze LCD1 had no trouble running on both Geshelli amps. The Avantone Planar, which requires 250 milliwatts at peak performance, also got plenty of power. The hifi Man Sundara did not sound noticeably different on the Geshelli products versus when I compared it on the Shit Magni Heresy and the Topping A30 Pro. However, you can forget about using the Modhouse Argon or any T50RP variant on the Geshelli products. They simply do not provide enough power. Modhouse, for example, recommends a minimum of 1 watt at 50 ohms, and Fostech says that the T50RP could use up to 3 watts. When I compare the Archell 2 Pro and the Erish against the Magni and the A30 Pro, I'm left very confused. I do not understand why some people are hyping Geshelli products. Their performance, at least in power output, is substandard. Now, don't get me wrong. Perhaps the Archell and Erish will provide enough power for whatever gear you have. But considering they sound identical to similarly priced or cheaper products, the diminutive power output is simply disappointing. One other aspect I want to touch upon is the measurements Geshelli provides. I am sick and tired of companies providing only one point of reference for power output, especially if that measurement is for 16 ohms. There is simply no excuse for Geshelli to not provide power output measurements for 32 ohms and 150 ohms and 300 ohms and 600 ohms. I am not advocating for more and more power like some striped pants clown on YouTube. I am merely pointing out that without more specific measurements, all I have to go off is a singular measurement which is comparatively low. And when you consider the price of these Geshelli amplifiers, you cannot help but compare them against alternatives which do give more. If you have any aspirations of using difficult-to-drive headphones such as the HE6 or Aria or T50RP or the R70X, then you may want to consider alternative amplifiers. I appreciate Dave sending me his gear to review. If you want to follow the Honest Audiophile, go to Dave's website and touch base with him there. I know there are some people who make a big fuss out of Geshelli products. Now, having used 3 of their products for several weeks, I simply do not see the justification for the hype. From what I can tell, the Geshelli gear is well built. It is different in design, and that may or may not be to your liking. But fundamentally, Geshelli products are simple and perhaps too simple in some respects. I do not see the point of having 2 amplifiers when one could do the job just as well. It is rare that I see an amp that provides only balanced XLR output. Why not just make a balanced and unbalanced output on one amp instead of wasting time, energy, and money on another product that provides only quarter-range output? I'm sure Geshelli has some reasons for doing what they did, but I fail to see the logic. When I look at the J2, I'm still confused. The stock version of this DAC has 4 SPDIF inputs. Yes, there are probably some, very few people who want 4 SPDIF connections, but that cannot be the majority. To get USB functionality, you have to add an additional $50 to the price. And the J2 does not have Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, a remote, or MQA support. All of this brings us to value. No, Geshelli products are not value. Maybe you could make an argument that the Archell 2 is not that much more expensive than the Magni and has enough power for most typical applications, but there's still nothing here to hype about. Let's start with the Geshelli amps. The Archell 2 Pro and Erish are fine products and probably would have made sense 5 years ago, but they are oddly out of place in this decade. They sound identical to the shit Magni Heresy and topping A30 Pro. Yet, both the Heresy and A30 each have attributes that make those competitors stand out in a comparison against the Geshelli stuff. For example, the Heresy easily trounces the Archell 2 Pro. The Heresy is cheaper, built as well as the Archell, has far greater power output, and sounds exactly the same. You could opt to buy the replacement for the Archell 2 Pro, which is the Archell 2 GMR. The GMR has 1 watt instead of 600 milliwatts at 16 ohms, but once again, the GMR is a bit more expensive than the Heresy and has less power. The Erish is $200 and lacks both power output and connectivity to justify that price tag. The Erish provides 1 watt at 32 ohms, which the far cheaper Heresy can do without resorting to balanced architecture. You could buy the shit Magnius for the same price, yet get far more power and more connectivity than the Erish. Frankly, you could buy the Monolith Liquid Spark or hifi Zencan for much less money than the Erish as well. When we turn to the J2 DAC, I see a product that misses the point. You can paint as many rainbow colors as you want on your DAC, but unless it offers some usable functionality, it's just a pretty paperweight. The J2 with USB connection costs $300, yet it offers basic functionality. In fact, you will find similar audio resolution support on the SML Sanskrit or topping E30, yet both of those products cost far less than the J2. Take a look at the Songcause LAQXD1 and you'll notice that it has the same audio resolution support, the same sound, and at least some semblance of portability. And the Songcause is about $100 cheaper. I don't see the rationale for pushing Geshelli gear. If these guys release a DAC amp combo for around $250, then we could have a chat. But instead, we get separate units that are simply overpriced for what they offer. If the Archell 2 Pro cost $100 or had more power, maybe I'd have a different opinion. If the Erish had more connectivity and power, I would probably have a more positive outlook. If the J2 did not cost $300 for basic functionality, I might give it reserved approval. But we don't live in a world of what-ifs. We live in reality. Well, at least some of us do. No, the Geshelli Archell 2 Pro, the Erish, and the J2 are not value. They are overpriced, underfeatured, and provide nothing unique except for appearance.